This episode of Beyond the Post is recorded using Riverside.fm. Riverside is your all-in-one web-based podcast and video studio offering in-studio quality recording, editing, social media magic clips using AI, transcriptions, show notes, and more. Find out more about Riverside.fm by heading over to beyondthepost.fm/Riverside. Welcome back to Beyond the Post with Robb Dunewood and Bodie Grimm. I'm Robb Dunewood.
And I'm Bodie Grimm.
And this week, we're interviewing Roger Chang, executive producer and booker of the award-winning Daily Tech News Show. We'll dive into Roger's 25-plus year career producing some of the hottest tech content on both television and the interwebs, and we'll find out what advice he has for those working behind the scenes in today's independent media production landscape. Roger Chang is currently the executive producer and booker for Daily Tech News Show, but he got to start over a quarter century ago at ZDTV, back when he was a producer for the network's two daily shows, The Screensavers and Call for Help. I personally became aware of Roger's work around the time Tech TV came about and that new set that was built for The Screensavers. Roger, I think that was back like in 2021.
Yeah, 2001. That was a long time ago, but yeah, we just got bought by Vulcan Ventures, which is part of Paul Allen's investment group. And we wanted to shake things up, and Screensavers at the time was one of the most popular shows on the network. So they wanted to give it a little more a splash, a little more presence.
I remember watching, I believe, the very first episode of The Screensavers when the change from ZDTV to Tech TV happened. And I remember, looking at that cool set and just looking at the show. And I don't know if you saw this post I put on social media. This is probably back in July or August of last year. But I said, man, I remember thinking to myself back then, it's like, man, this is really cool. It's like you got folks that are literally on television talking about tech. How cool is that? And then fast forward 20 years, and I'm now working with you and Tom and Sarah and, Norton and all these other folks that came from that era, to, Megan Maroney, just so many folks that I'm actually in the world working with today. I just thought that how cool that is.
It is a very, very interesting journey, because when the network, when Tech TV, before Tech TV started and was ZDTV, it was really an outgrowth of a publishing empire, the Ziff Davis publishing group, and a lot of the concepts that went into it were originally laid out when Ziff Davis had a co-production with NBC as part of the MSNBC. Trying to remember the site was a co-collaboration, and after that ended, there was talk of like, well, why don't we just do our own channel, and we'll do a cable network, which was back then was in vogue. I mean, everyone who wanted to be in TV just started up their own channel. And the idea behind it was, let us take all this information we have that is spread across, I think at the time was 5 or 6 different computer magazines amongst many other Ziff Davis publications, and kind of coalesce that into a series of shows on a channel that is branded Ziff Davis, thus the ZD and ZDTV. But I did not start until after that got launched, and I was an intern. So I was, when I got started, was 23. So I was right out of school, literally, because I graduated that summer of my internship, and they offered me a job.
So you were an intern at Tech TV or ZDTV, and then you got hired as an employee. What was your job? Did it change, or just the responsibilities change?
So when I was an intern, there was an intern program that Ziff Davis had, and at least for what they called back then the Help Pod, that was the name that they gave to Call for Help and Screensavers together, called the Help Pod. And the interns for that show had at least 4 different duties. One was to answer the phone, clear out the voicemail. You hear all the messages that people leave, because this was before email was as widely used as it is today. And so a lot of people did what they did back then during call radio. They just called and left a message on the voicemail. So our job was to go through, transcribe that, and clear out the voicemail and see if there were any usable questions for the show. The second bits were more kind of specific to what the producers needed. So sometimes I was a gopher. I would literally bring things to the studio and bring them back, because at the time, our studios, actually for the entire time, our studios and our offices were in two physically different locations. And we had a little shuttle that went between them. And so my job was to bring stuff back and forth from the studio back, as well as help at the time Phil Allingham, who was the tech PA for both shows, and to help assist him if he needed it.
So Roger, going back, you started doing this back in the late 90s. How did you go from where you were actually an intern, then, you became a producer, you're doing all kind of stuff on set, much of it behind the scenes, sometimes on camera. How did you go from that to where you are today, a producer of Daily Tech News Show? And, Daily Tech News Show is, a very long running, technology news show, that, has literally thousands of episodes where you put content out every single weekday. How did you just go from where you were to where you are today?
So it's very interesting, because when I went into ZDTV at the time, I was just looking for an internship because I needed to fill my internship class quota in order to get all my credits to graduate. So when I interned there, I already interned at two other places of varying levels of satisfaction on my part. And, Ziff Davis offered the last thing I needed to graduate. So I went into it. And at the time, I had a very limited understanding of what the network beyond it was beyond that. It was Ziff Davis, and it was about computer technology, and it was a 24-hour network. And so when I started, I just kind of did what they asked me to do, but I was already partial to a lot of the content that the network, or at least the shows that I worked on, Call for Help and Screensavers, put out. So I involved myself with a lot of that stuff that they needed, whether it was helping Phil set up particular equipment, or talking to the various elements that the show needed to run. So people at the time, before it was called IT, it was called IS, Information Services, that department, as well as talking to the studio people, who incidentally, if you've listened to my podcast I did last year about the Tech TV scrapbook, a lot of the people I worked with were also classmates. So a lot of us from SF State were working there. So in a way, it felt very familiar, but also very, like, oh, we're just in another grade, or we're another level of university, because now I'm still working with the same people, but we're now doing stuff for an actual private for-profit company. And so I did a lot of that. And as I did, I really took advantage of all the opportunities that presented itself to not just do more stuff, but to learn about it. And so when the time came at the end of my internship, they actually needed a PA to fill out, because Phil Allingham moved over to the ZDTV labs. And so they had an opening. And I'm not sure if it's as relevant as it is today, but back then internships were a key stepping stone to getting into a corporate environment or a business environment. And so they already knew I had the acumen to do the job. It was really just more of a academic process of making sure I was out of college, because at the time the Ziff Davis required everyone to at least have a college degree, and I had nothing else to do. So I agreed to it, and that's how I started. As I did that job, again, I took advantage of all the opportunities, whether it was talking to guests that we had on, whether it was talking to some of the other show producers, not the ones that worked strictly on Screensavers or Call for Help, but some of the adjacent shows as well. And there were a few opportunities to work with other groups as well that I took advantage of. And I will say, when you come out of college, when you come out of university, and you're immediately dropped into an environment that seems very 10-foot tall to you, like it's like being dropped out of your JV team in high school, and suddenly you're either playing, you might be a third string quarterback in a pro team, but you're in a pro club, right? And so there was very much of the like, wow, you felt the enormity of it, and so I was very, very circumspect about everything I did, because the last thing I wanted to be was the guy who screwed up something that affected the show or affected someone's behavior or affected something negatively. So I kept doing that, and the most important thing that I got out of Tech TV ZDTV was networking. That's where I met Patrick Norton. I met Leo Laporte. I met Scott Harriet. I met a number of people in the company that would later on become very crucial in how my career path sort of like directed itself. As when Tech TV eventually got bought by Comcast and turned into G4 TV, I was offered the opportunity to move down with them to become, at the time, kind of the geek on the network. But I turned that down mostly because the pay offer was marginally better than what I was already getting paid, which wasn't really that much. And I had some personal commitments already in the area, not in the area, but family and other things. So I decided to kind of pass on that, and I picked up a job at CNET. And I worked for GameSpot, the game review site, and I was there for about a year and a half, and I left that, and then I ended up working again for Ziff Davis, but this time for the Ziff Davis publishing arm, which was going through bankruptcy reorganization. And I got that because two people I knew from Tech TV, Patrick Norton and Jim Louderback, were looking for someone to help them fill out their VOD, their video on demand streaming show called DLTV. And so I helped them out with a couple of CESs, and then they just hired me as a producer.
I want to interrupt you for a second, because that seems like that's a change, because you went from where you were cable TV to where now it's video on demand. So
yes.
How did that change? I know that's not necessarily where we are today with like YouTube and, Twitch, that kind of stuff. But how did that video demand, how was that different in your career from what you had been doing when it was that, that old school cable that we think of back in the early 2000s?
So just to fill you in a little bit about what I was doing at Screensavers Call for Help. Initially, I was kind of the tech PA. My job was to make sure all the computers are set up for the shoot, the daily shoot. That means software that needed to be installed, web bookmarks. So we needed to have this site, that site up. If there was hardware that needed to be installed, whether it was a USB device or just a standalone, like a game console, like a PlayStation 2, I had to make sure that was up and running and plugged into a TV and working. So I would have to coordinate with the studio crew, and they would, what we would call clear scan, which is basically making sure the scan between the TV and the camera were in sync, so you wouldn't see a scan line when you were watching at home on any of the displays. As I went through, and as often happens, if anyone who's ever worked in a corporate environment where there's a lot of people who move on because they get better opportunities. I think one of the things I should mention is this is the kind of height of the .com bubble. So a lot of people were leaving for .coms, whether it was like, PetSmart or there were a few for a little site called Ask Jeeves, which was supposed to be like a Yahoo competitor. And so there were constant openings because people were just up and going. And as you move up, openings open up, people kind of shift all in one. And so they needed a producer. And so since I was already a PA and I was familiar with everything, they said, "Oh, you want to be a producer too?" It's like, all right, I'll do it. So I was a tech PA producer, learned all my TV chops. I did guest interviews. I had to come up with segments about help and how to. So whether it was from a viewer email or something that Leo had at the top of his mind, I would kind of implement or develop that into something that you would watch on TV. When I moved out of that, my first real taste of doing video for web was at GameSpot, because at the time they were doing a lot of game developer interviews, as well as game reviews, where they would just review a game and I would sit there, record it, and then edit out all the stuff they didn't need for the stand-up interview and throw in all the game footage to go with it. So that was my first one, and it was a very interesting shift at the time, because for the most part, a lot of what the web streaming video was of two varieties. It was existing television content that was just repackaged and streamed online, and the second half of the other half was purposely made video. And at that time, a lot of companies put the bare minimum in terms of money and investment in that. So it had a very threadbare feel about it. It would just be a person there looking into a camera and they would be talking. GameSpot tried to straddle the two. Ryan McDonald, who was in charge of GameSpot Live, the department I was in, was trying to kind of up the values, and that's why they brought me on board. So I helped them with lighting, because oftentimes they were shooting these game editors and they were just poorly lit. So you just thought there was like a light off in the studio, or the audio was less than desirable for a web streaming audience, because, as we all know, web streaming was very, very much limited to the 100K or less in terms of bit rate. So you really had to massage the audio in order to make it sound the best at that bit rate. So when I eventually ended up at DLTV, I was already familiar with the process. Really what it was at that point was how do you get content that people will sit and watch? And I think that was the biggest difficulty, or the biggest challenge, I should say, was growing an audience. And that, I think, most of all, was what I picked up from my time at the Ziff Davis Publishing, was growing an audience. Because it's a question that people kind of struggle with today, whether you're on TikTok, whether you're doing YouTube videos, whether you have your own RSS stream. Growing the audience has always been the number one, challenge for any creator. And when I eventually ended up at Revision 3, we tried a variety of avenues. It was, collaboration with existing high popularity creators. It's doing viral content, which, when I look back, I always thought was a little misguided, because trying to find and create a viral video generally tends not to work, because viral videos, by their very definition, come out of something that no one expects. When I finally ended up with a Daily Tech News show, a lot of what we've done over the years is how do we cultivate, how do we keep, and how do we expand our listener, our audience base? Because really, for any creator, you live and die by your audience. Some do very well. If you look at the Mr. Beasts, if you look at even the iJustines and Justin, who created Twitch, there are all these big stories about individuals who've really made it big, but there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of other people who are still trying to get that critical mass of people. And back maybe 5 years ago, was all about how do we not game, but how do we ride the algorithm, whether it's YouTube or whatever platform, in order to get to get a higher profile.
Have you found any strategies that work better than others for what you do personally, or what the team at DTNS does?
One strategy I have always found to be very worthwhile and very I don't want timeless. Timeless sounds kind of maybe hokey, but it is a timeless thing. Is that you appreciate the audience that watches you, whether it was Call for Help or Screensavers. One of the key hooks of the show is that we interacted with the audience. We acknowledged their existence and acknowledged their contribution to the show, whether it was in the form of questions or video calls. Still weird to me that like we pioneered that whole thing of people just calling in with little consumer webcams from 3Com, or DLTV revision 3, just and to now to Daily Tech News Show, having that rapport with an audience, your existing audience, is so important, because like any other venture that you might do, having an ecosystem that's around you is very important. And for creators, that is your audience. And if you're lucky, you can score big, and you can be a little more maybe a little more capricious about how you approach your audience. But for most, I think understanding and then being honest with the audience, not like doing weird switch and baits or pretending to be something that you're not, or pretending your content is something that it's not. Because if you can either go one of two ways, you can keep and grow an audience, or you can just kind of funnel in people who see your content and are really excited, and then they never watch again. But then you have to find someone else to replace them, because what you want are repeat customers.
So, Roger, in terms of podcasting, you have a fairly large audience at DTNS, and you also have a fairly large team. Most podcasters, it's usually a 1, 2, maybe 3 person shop, but it's quite a production over at Daily Tech News Show. So, how do you effectively juggle all of the needs of the show versus the needs of the host versus the needs of the guest, and produce this? Because once again, Daily Tech News Show is exactly like the name sounds. This is something that you're doing every single day. And from someone who is now part of that team, it is a very, very well-oiled machine. But you were doing this for 10 years before I personally joined the team. So could you just, kind of walk us through how you actually get to where you've grown to where Daily Tech News Show is today, but how you just keep all those moving parts? Because as I said, it's an operation. This is not, it's not a couple guys working out of their basement. This is a team of people that are planted all over the United States that are helping you produce and create this show.
I mean, it's kind of weird that you say it is such a production, because, and this is not to downplay what we do or what any of the other, whether it's Tom, Joe, Sarah, you work on the show, but I've always understood it as being a very kind of like lean operation. Like, you have to understand, when I come from TV, there is an entire studio full of people whose whole job is to make sure the video is shot correctly and broadcast to the appropriate satellite, so it gets to the correct audience. When I was at Revision 3, we had an entire bay of editors whose only job it was to edit and make everything look nice. We had a studio crew, and granted, it was small, but it was 3 people that were in the studio that would help, that were shooting, recording, doing all the audio stuff. And so we're in this place now where we're all, whether it's Sarah, Tom, myself, we're all doing portions of that. And I think one of the big keys with that is that Tom, myself, and Sarah have all gone through a similar production background, like television, and then like web streaming, and then podcasting. And for Tom and Sarah, they were over at Twit with Leo Laporte, and so there's an understanding of what works and what doesn't. But I think one of the key things to do is, how do you divide up the tasks? How do you divide up the labor? Right? It's very much of finding out. For example, during the rundown production, while I'm responsible for the show, it's either Tom, Sarah that is responsible, or in some days you, Rob, for or in this case for Daily Tech Headlines, responsible for the rundown. That means the content that goes in. as well as any ancillaries. I am responsible for any of the guest content. So when we have a guest on board, I've already pre-interviewed them, and I already have an idea of the content that we need to go out in it. But having a clear understanding of the division of labor is crucial. Joe is there as our tech producer, so he's there to make sure that StreamYard is acting correctly. He has all the elements that he needs. He can switch from his system, and he's not having problems. Worst case scenario, I'm his backup. It's one reason why we use StreamYard, though. If he's having an issue, I can jump in and things will still work. The second very important thing is to have a production calendar. And this is something, that I've done since the television. I've always, looked a month out. It used to be every 2 weeks, but, generally speaking, looking a month out gives you enough time, whether it's a guest, whether it's a production element that you want to include. It gives you enough time to figure out how to do it. But more importantly, if you can do it, and if something breaks, what do you do to fill in that content hole when that thing doesn't work out? Also, when it comes to guests, it gives me enough time to ask a guest about dates that they can come on, and they can look. Oh, hey, I'm at a trade show, or I'm at a convention, or I have a business meeting. I can easily work around that instead of trying to fight everything out a week out, which in my experience tends to be a little too short. So I tend to look anywhere from 3 to 4 weeks out in terms of the production calendar. Crucial if you want to have a lot of guests on the show, but it's also good to have if you want to plan content. For example, if you have particular holidays, or you have back to school, what do you need? Or summer events, or we have CES. CES was one that Tom, Sarah, and I knocked our heads around a couple of weeks before Christmas break. Not so much the content, but more about what we were doing and how we were going to do it. So just having a production calendar and looking at it on a daily basis is crucial if you don't want to trip over your own feet.
What if you do? What if you do want to trip over your own feet? Just throw it out the window?
You can. I mean, I've seen producers kind of wing it. And in some of those cases it works, but their shows tend to be weekly, not daily. When I was at Revision 3, I had Techzilla, which was twice a week, but I also had HD Nation, which is once a week, and I also had another 3 shows that I was managing. So my entire week was filled up. I was doing IO9's our opinions are We Come from the Future. I did a YouTube show that we had contractually worked with YouTube called Downloaded, which was a pundit show. So imagine the McNair. I don't think anyone knows. Just imagine your standard kind of CNN pundit show, except that it's about tech. And that was, so four out of my 5 days I was shooting, and then after I was shooting, I was coming back and making edit notes and going through the calendar, as well as writing new segments for Texel. Really, the calendar is important because if you have so many moving pieces, it allows you to figure out when pieces might collide. So if someone's sick, if someone's out, or in the case of DTNS or my previous work, hey, we're going to be dark, so we need to double up on shoots. So we have some content to fill, even though no one's going to be in the studio or in the office for that week. So it is something that everyone should do. In my recommendation, unless you like having aneurysms and perennially high blood pressure.
So Roger, one of the things we do, Bodie and I, at the end of the show, we run into these rapid fire questions, but I think you have actually answered one of them. Like, one of our questions is like, what is your number one production tip for putting a quality show together? And you just gave us all that. Yeah. So I think that might, a calendar, production calendar from a producer standpoint sounds like that is a pretty important thing to do. And as we said, folks who don't know, Daily Tech News Show is an everyday show with multiple hosts that there's rotating hosts. You've got contributors coming in. There are a lot of moving parts. And one of the things I always say is that when you're in the middle of something, you don't necessarily realize how much it is, or you don't really think about it unless you kind of take a step outside and look back at it. But there's dozens of contributors. You've got guests coming in. There's just so many moving parts. So I want to give you a rapid fire question, related to the one that you've already answered about your number one production tip. What is a tool that you would recommend for building your production calendar in?
The best tool I have often found is the one that you'll use. Like you could spend $1,000 on a software suite or an office suite that will help you manage it. But if it's something that you don't feel comfortable with, or you find hard to understand, you probably won't use it. And as a tool, that means it's failed in its job. For example, I use Google Calendar. But before then, I've used a variety of tools. I used Lotus Notes. I've used iCal. I've used something that enables me or empowers me to look constantly at the calendar on a regular basis and not have to fiddle with special tools. Amos, our part-time tech producer, and helps Tom with Word with Tom and a few other shows. He uses Oksana to kind of schedule his duties, which is Asana. What's Asana?
Yeah.
Asana. To kind of, because he finds it to be very, he finds it a tool that he can integrate with very easily, and that he is constantly on. So it's providing him the feedback. You want to make sure that you have a tool. It can be very simple. It can be, again, I use Google Calendar, but it has to be something that you will use every day, and you don't have to be forced. It's just an automatic thing. Like you're not forcing yourself to figure out how things work, because the more time you spend trying to work out the kinks in your calendar on the software tool that is your calendar, the less time you're spending paying attention to all the stuff you need for your production.
Excellent. This next one may or may not fall under the same thing that Rob asked. What is a piece of gear that you would recommend to somebody?
I would have to say just, a good laptop. And I specifically say laptop because there are times where you will have either a flash of brilliance or you just won't be at home, but you still want to punch content in. And a laptop's a great way to do it. I know some people want to use foldable phones, and I know some people love using tablets, but I always find that to be, at least for me, to be really productive, I need a good keyboard. And when it comes to keyboard, unless you're willing to haul a switch keyboard with you wherever you go, there are some laptops like the ThinkPads that have really outstanding keyboards that, where when you type, you don't feel like you're working against the wind in order to get your thoughts across.
So, Roger, a lot of folks who listen, to our show, they are interested in being in front of the camera, in front of the microphone. But we also have some who are absolutely interested in being behind the mic, being behind the camera. So what is your best piece of advice for someone who wants to actually move more into that realm of podcast producing specifically?
So if you're coming at, and you've never done it before, you want to do podcasting, what I would say is understand all the elements of it, whether it is being in front of the camera or being on mic. You want to have a clear understanding of each of those roles, what each of those elements needs to be, because it gives you a much better picture of what it will take you to produce it and deliver that product, whether it's a daily schedule or weekly schedule or bi-weekly schedule. It's very important that you understand, because podcasting, like radio, is a very intimate medium. And if there's nothing else that you take away from anything I've said today, one thing you will need to do is to listen back to what you've made constantly. It's the only way that anyone ever gets better, right? You can tell someone, hey, Rob, you did great on this one, but maybe next time you want to do it this way. Well, you won't have a frame of reference. You won't have context until you've listened to that exact same episode. And a lot of people tend to be very sheepish, whether it's listening or watching themselves or something that they've done, because there's an element of self-criticism that you need to be able to constructively digest in order to make the product better. So, listening to your stuff on a regular basis is key, because then you understand what people are listening to on a regular basis, and you can make a value judgment on whether or not your content should shift. We do this semi-regularly with DTNS. We call it air check, where we all listen to one episode and we come back with notes about what we've heard or seen and what we think could be better, because a show needs to constantly adjust, whether it's because the content changes or the format changes, or maybe you decide instead of a weekly show you want to do a daily show, and so you need to be able to understand what that product is from all the way around, right? From when you start writing, from when you record, for what you put out, and the end product. So that means being able to listen and listen to it all the way through.
I want to give you one last rapid fire question. There seems to be a debate right now on the internet, audio versus video. Do you have a take? Is it one or the other? Is it both? Is whatever is necessary? What is your take on the debate right now of audio versus video when it comes to creating content?
And this is very important. It depends on what your final output is. If you are doing a TikTok video where a bulk of your messaging is captions or graphics or something that is visually processed, yeah, the video is more important. But 9 times out of 10, whether it's a podcast, whether it's a TikTok of a YouTube short, and you're talking, audio psychologically is more important to the listener, and this is to the audience. And the reason why is this: the human brain will accept crappier video as long as the information that they hear is intelligible. And the reason why is this is because, although we are visual creatures, we process a majority of the stuff around us through our ears. And if you've ever watched, or if you've ever grown up with a rabbit ear TV, you'll accept, really poor, like mediocre picture quality if you can hear what they're saying, because then you get an understanding of what's happening. If you try watching TV with the volume off, you tell me what's going on after 10 minutes of watching. You can maybe give me vague generalities about they're having an argument or they're having a discussion or there's an emergency, but you won't actually get the full scope of what's happening without listening to it, unless, of course, you have captions. So for me, audio.
Roger, thank you so much for being really generous with your time. Do you have anything that you would like to plug or point anybody to your socials?
Yeah, if you can, if you haven't listened to it already, Daily Tech News Show at dailytechnewsshow.com. And also watch Eileen Rivera's and Sarah Lane's new show, Apple Vision Show. Get it? Apple Vision Show. Great show about Apple products. If you're an Apple fan or just Apple curious, definitely worth watching.
So, Roger Chang, thank you so much for taking this 40 minutes or so to spend with Bodie and I. We really appreciate you coming and hanging out with us. And, once again, everybody who's listening, go check out Daily Tech News Show. I'm not doing a self-plug. I'm plugging our guests because, I am a co-host of that show as well. But if you like tech and if you're listening to this show, you probably do. That's a good one to go check out. So, Roger, until we talk again.
Thank you for having me.